Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Today we're going to start a series of episodes on a controversial subject within Christian circles, the topic of intelligent design. Have you ever come across this term, Scott?
Oh, yes, very much so. And I remember even before the intelligent design as a movement had begun, I came across William Dembski's book, The Design Inference, which was a kind of a breakthrough book on the idea of how would we detect design? If there is design, how would we know that something had been designed? And this is where he comes up with specified complexity and things of that nature. And then, of course, when Behe's Darwin Black Box came out, read that as well. And to be honest, I was hopeful at the time. I thought, well, this is exciting stuff, and maybe maybe this is something that will really challenge the kind of standard worldview of Darwinism. Not so much the science, but the idea of just complete random materialism,
Right.
So I thought that was very interesting. And unfortunately, the more I read and the more critiques I read and so on and so forth, eventually, I have to admit, I kind of came to the understanding that no, it probably isn't what we had hoped for. And so how about you?
Well, I've said it before that I have mixed feelings about this. I do believe there is some kind of a creative life force that started that cosmic egg rolling. And I also believe that there is some kind of purpose and meaning to our existence. So that opens up the door to the whole idea of design or, maybe even intervention. And if, again, that creative life force, if that's in any way personified, then it would have to be intelligent. So how do I say, no, I don't believe it, but I'm a Christian? I'm conflicted. But like you, I've been hearing a lot of things, reading it and thinking about it, and there are cracks forming under the foundations for both of those statements. I do struggle with the whole idea of personifying God, putting him in a box, a person box, and then reducing him more to our human level, just so we do that so we can understand him or understand it better. And I have scientific problems with the idea that we were designed, huge concerns, and the listeners are going to hear about that later in this episode.
Yeah. I guess for me, this is kind of getting ahead of things, I know, but just to kind of put it out there, it seems to strike me at the end of the day as kind of back to a God of the gaps type of thing, where most of that I've read in the ID community, most of them seem to believe in common descent, for example, and they do believe in the evolutionary process, at least at the level of species. And then it's kind of like, but there's these things that we can't explain, except that there was some sort of design,
right?
And then we kind of relegate God to that part of it, or relegate intelligence at least to that part of it.
To the gap, exactly.
Yeah. Now I know they argue very much against the idea that it's God of the gaps, but I just haven't been so convinced by what I've read. So yeah.
Right. So then over the next few weeks, we're going to talk to some scholars about this. Some of them will be Christian scholars speaking outside of their areas of expertise. And so I'm working hard to line up experts, people who are working directly in those scientific areas that we'll be touching on, because quite frankly, they're the best ones to interpret the data that they're collecting. But before we get into those more scholarly deep dives with those experts, we need to set the stage for this topic and give a full explanation of what advocates of intelligent design claim. Now, we've already done an episode on this over 3 years ago, episode number 21, when Boyd Blundell was helping me launch this podcast. He was my co-host for the first 2 years, but then wanted to move on to other projects. And Scott, you were happy to fill his big shoes.
They are big shoes, and I don't know Boyd well, certainly not as well as you do, because I know you've been friends for a long time. But
and you met him at least once, right?
Yes, I did, and had a great conversation with him. His particular area of expertise in philosophy is an area of great interest to me as well. So he was able to help me understand a few things that I didn't, and referred me to his book and so on. So it was a very humbling kind of thing that you asked me to do. And I really enjoyed it. It's been very selfish for me personally, because to be honest, I don't know how much I have contribute at times, but I get to listen and talk to all of these experts, and many of them kind of my heroes and people that I've read in the past and so on. And I've just had a great time doing that.
And that one-time meeting, that was back a long time ago, back when I was bringing together, I was trying to find people who were critically thinking, well-read, and Christian-minded people, still believers, when I was really struggling with, do I still hang on to this? And I've often referred to that as my therapy group. That was where you met Boyd, I seem to remember.
That's correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
so,
right.
My faith rehab group.
Yeah.
Okay. So we want to re-release this previous episode that I did with Boyd. There's no point in Scott and I just repeating all the very same points. And besides, we said this, I think, 6 weeks ago, roughly. This is the summer holidays, and we needed a break from recording and editing and producing. It is a lot of work. And we said we would be releasing old episodes, but we haven't done so yet. So this is a perfect opportunity to do just that.
To our listeners out there, by the way, Luke doesn't know how to take a break. So I think Luke's been busier this summer than I've ever seen him, but that's fine with me. But anyway, so this will actually be more of a genuine break.
But in my defense, it's not that well, maybe I'm a workaholic, but this isn't why I keep doing the podcast. I've said it before many times when people talk to me. I do this podcast because I myself am on an exploration. I'm trying to figure out some of these things.
Yeah.
How it relates to my world of science. And so I'm asking the questions, and then I talk to people, and I turn that into a podcast, and you benefit. I share that with you, the listener. And so it's not that I'm just working. I'm learning. I'm loving what I do. So
yeah, well, that's great.
Now, here's a word to the listeners. As you listen to this episode, in addition to paying attention to the actual content of what we're saying, I want you to notice something else. Okay, again, this is an episode that we released 3 years ago, and you might not have thought to look at it because you think, well, it's old news. Even though we recorded that more than 3 years ago, all the content is still current. It hasn't faded. It's as fresh as when we first released it. And podcasters will refer to these kinds of episodes as evergreen. They don't drop their leaves and die. And here's my point. There's a long list of other episodes just like that in our archive of 130 episodes on all kinds of scientific and theological topics. So don't think that just because they're old, 3 years old, that they're not worth listening to.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things about our podcast is we deal with big issues, and big overarching issues do have to have that evergreen aspect to them. Typically, we're not talking about current events. Those kind of things do get more dated. And there's been a few where we've touched on a few things. I think during the pandemic, for example.
Yeah, the COVID would be one that's not evergreen. I get that.
Right. Yeah. Most of the stuff we deal with, these are not things that are going to be substantially changed anytime soon kind of thing. Yeah.
So again, to the listener, take a look at the listing of our previous episodes. You can either just rifle through the catalog at your favorite podcast provider, or we have at the Recovering Evangelicals website, there's an archive. You can just look at a listing of, they're listed either chronologically or you can look at them thematically. There's also a link to the various speakers that we've had. And if you're dialed into the world of science and faith dialogue, I think you'll be impressed with the people that we've had on our virtual studio over the past 3 years. So excuse this shameless plug for our podcast, and now we bring to you a previously recorded introduction to intelligent design. Couldn't happen at a worse time. You're casually sipping from your coffee in a room full of people when it all goes very wrong. You take a careless sip, and it goes down the wrong tube. Your throat immediately seizes up, your gut starts to spasm in an attempt to push it back up, while your tongue is struggling to stop that from happening in order to avoid making a spectacle of yourself, and you make a valiant effort to keep the whole internal struggle hidden from everyone around you. Your eyes start to bug out, your chest begins to heave, and then, despite knowing that it only goes downhill from here, you attempt a small, inaudible cough. But within seconds, you're hacking and spewing your drink across the room, and so you meekly make your exit with all eyes on you as you wipe a few drops of coffee from your nose. That's why I can't embrace intelligent design anymore.
And with that lovely fetching example, we begin a discussion of what is perhaps the most controversial topic when it comes to the relationship between science and religion, which is the topic of intelligent design. So a little bit of background on the history of this term. I want to deal with it first as a political issue and then as the actual substance of what they claim. So intelligent design is something that emerged back in the 80s, and it was posing as a scientific opposition to Darwinism. And it was immediately pushed back at by the scientific community and identified as some sort of stalking horse, some way that creationism was trying to get into the scientific discussion without identifying it as such. And it does turn out that that's not an unreasonable accusation, in that they found some evidence that that's specifically what they were doing, including finding, most famously, a textbook set where they literally tried to institute a creationist textbook into a curriculum by simply subbing out the word creationism and putting in intelligent design. That's a real thing. You can read about that. You can look that up. But
Pandas and People is the title.
Oh, Pandas and People, yes. And so on that side, intelligent design has had this history where it is not easily divorced from the creationists who really wanted this to happen. I'm much more interested in the other side of intelligent design, which was, what was it as it claimed to be? Because I believe that when you're thinking about things, especially if you're thinking about things scientifically, if the idea has a poor motivation behind it, that doesn't invalidate the idea. And so we need to look at it on its own. And for many people, I think in that movement, it actually is a very honest thing that they're doing. I think particularly someone like Michael Behe was actually doing work that he thought was honest, and that he really did have this problem with Darwinian evolution, and he really was trying to handle the issue as a scientist. And that's just the claim. To kind of boil it down most simply, he claimed that the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations, which is the Darwinian theory of evolution in a nutshell, was not sufficient to explain how complex things get. In other words, that there hasn't been enough time. The idea that randomness could eventually come up with this, it just doesn't work according to scale. And so this idea was called irreducible complexity, that you had biological mechanisms. The most sort of common one that people refer to is the retina. His go-to example was something much uglier terminology-wise, the bacterial flagellum. And it was the idea that that has so much complexity to it that when you say what it evolved from, you can't account for so many little stages in between that were all somehow evolutionarily adaptive. That the creature who had this evolution happen to the bacterial flagellum had to have dozens of mutations in between, all of which were awful for survival before you get to the good one. Mm. And so the argument of irreducible complexity is that you can't produce something that complex in an environment where bad mutations are punished, which is, the world we live in from a Darwinian perspective.
Nature red in tooth and claw.
There you go. Oh, Luke's feeling all poetic about this. And one of the reasons I'm introducing this is that this is actually a very difficult topic for scientists to talk about, I've discovered over the years, because of that political aspect I mentioned, that this really was sort of thin edge of the wedge of creationists trying to get back in. And scientists are rightfully very leery of this kind of thing. But that also means, because there's this political battle happening, nobody's actually thinking very clearly about the topic itself. So I, who am not really threatened in either direction and have fairly significant criticisms from both sides of this, I think we can gain something here by thinking about what was it that they were proposing, leaving aside why they were proposing it, and does that add to the discourse of trying to figure out how to live an authentic Christian faith in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So given that intelligent design actually gives this account, and if you kind of tie it back into the creationists, as describing things scientifically in a way that allows you to talk about some sort of designer, it's a very natural fit. And I'll admit that back when I was a late teenager and I had just left aside the idea that I just thought creationism was so, I just didn't think about it, because this did have probably the intended effect of some of the people behind it, and that it probably kept me tied to the idea of a creationist idea longer than I would have otherwise, because there was the credibility to it, because it was actually putting itself out there as some sort of science, which means that it's open to be challenged and disproved. Mm-hmm. And so given that this offers this many things for a scientist trying to figure out their Christian faith, I'm kind of curious, what are the issues that you have, Luke, as a Christian with intelligent design?
Right. So you'd think it's a no-brainer, right? I'm a Christian. I identify as a Christian, and you'd think that a Christian would say, "Well, look, God created everything, and He is exceptionally intelligent, so I believe in intelligent design." Truth is, I get really uneasy about embracing the idea of intelligent design. My answer to that question, why do I get uneasy, is it's just way too simplistic, and I've got three reasons. I'll just go through very quickly. First, it ignores the mountain of scientific data. That second book that we talked about in the earlier episodes about the two books analogy. And it can start to become a God of the gaps explanation. And those are always suspect. We're learning more and more how to explain things that previously we couldn't explain. So it's a God of the gaps argument. Second, it too quickly identifies function with design by an intelligent being. It's a faulty logic that is just too often employed in these circles. And third, and this is the biggest reason why I don't like ID, is that you can't have it both ways. You can't look at the positive aspects of our design and attribute that to a good and all-powerful God without finding very clumsy or even negative aspects of design and then not attribute that to an evil or incompetent creator. So let me give an example of how ID is often used, and I can take it or leave it at this level when it's used in this way. Let's talk about the retina. The retina, the eye, is a very complicated organ. It's an amazing piece of machinery that we humans and, well, basically all animals for that matter, they've got eyes. We've all been gifted with that. And we have ways to explain how eyes may have evolved from a simple cell in the body of some ancestral species, a cell that had some kind of a photoreceptor gene in it. And we can find evidence for that kind of evolution in the genes of all kinds of animals, from simple worms all the way to humans, who we like to say are so complex. Physiologically speaking, we're really not much more complex than a lot of the animals. So we can see the eye either as something evolved, or we can embrace the idea that God just created it and blessed animals and humans with that amazing ability. And we can do the same thing with a lot of other amazing things in our bodies, things like the brain, the heart, and our immune system. I could go on. Physiological processes like gene transcription and thinking and cognitive abilities and field development. It's easy to attribute these to an all-powerful and loving God. So on the surface, this looks like it's a simple choice. You either believe that these things evolved through the normal processes of biological evolution, or they were created. And on that level, it just looks like a simple choice of faith. That's all fine and well. If it's as simple as that, I'm happy to let people choose the design explanation. But let's look more carefully at certain examples of our design and see if they point to a random undirected process or to a loving and extremely intelligent and all-powerful creator God. And I'm going to warn you, this may be a very difficult discussion for some of our listeners, perhaps one that they even find offensive. But please realize that I'm just trying to look at raw facts here, and I think Boyd's with me on this too, just making sense of the data that's staring us in the face. And please realize that I'm not challenging God himself, but rather our interpretation of the facts and a pre-scientific interpretation of ancient scriptures. And realize that as a Christian who's benefited from a God-given passion for science and a God-given brain, I'm trying to make sense of these things and keep my Christian faith.
Now, before Luke goes on, I just want to point out that he's coming at this from the perspective of a scientist. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a theologian and ethicist, and you're going to find that we're making almost the exact same arguments. That there's going to be a strong similarity to the problem we have here.
Okay, so as I said, I'm a scientist by training. And so one valuable tool or strategy that we scientists often use is that we'll make a prediction and then see if it stands up to scrutiny, if it passes a certain test of believability. So let's use that tool, the strategy, as we look at the design of our bodies and ask the simple question, is this example of design better explained by a traditional creationism or by standard evolution? In other words, by a top-down, carefully considered design, or by a bottom-up, gradual accumulation of small, random, and unguided changes. The slow, gradual change involves building new features on top of old ones. I want to put an image in the minds of our listeners of this centuries-old, broken-down schoolhouse with a bell at the top of it. My wife and I, we have friends who bought this little run-down, old stone school building and renovated that and turned it into a beautiful modern house. And you can still clearly make out the old parts and see where the new renovations tie into the existing structure. There are old bricks and new ones. And buried in the wall, there may still be pulleys and cables that were previously used to ring the old school bell. Or maybe you'll find in those walls old lead pipes and aluminum wiring from a time before building codes were updated to copper. We do that kind of stuff so differently now than we did in the 1900s. So if you can imagine how that centuries-old rundown building can be renovated and retrofitted to make a modern new building, in the same way, the evolutionary model would predict that our bodies should still reveal certain old designs, remnants of old mechanisms that are no longer needed, or newer and better alternatives built on top of them, kind of like the copper wiring instead of aluminum and copper pipes instead of lead ones. On the other hand, if we are a unique and special creation, there should not be places where we see a hodgepodge. We should not see half of an old design and half of a new design. All the parts should be in their proper place and they should make sense. And if they're directly designed by an omnipotent, omniscient intelligence, then everything should work perfectly and make perfect sense. So, how do those two predictions pan out when we look honestly but critically at the design of our bodies? I'm going to start with a couple examples which are more humorous and, really unimportant. One example that I always throw out here is goosebumps. Those little hairs on your skin that stand up on their end when we get cold or when someone scares the jeepers out of us. Those hairs do this by a small muscle attached at their bases, and our body or the brain stimulate those muscles to contract. But why does our body or brain do that? Dogs and cats and deer and a lot of other animals have the same hairs, although they have a lot more of them. And they also fluff those hairs up when they're cold or when they're threatened. The thick covering of those muscularized hairs helps those animals to stay warm by trapping a thick blanket of air around them. And those hairs make the animal look a little bit bigger and sends out the message, I feel scared or angry and I will hurt you. So those hairs are part of a defensive strategy. Picture a dog with its hackles up or a cat arching her back, raising her tail and fluffing up that fur. It's all smoke and mirrors. The animal with its fur up is no more capable of taking down the adversary than they were a moment ago. But maybe it's enough to make that adversary pause and give things a second thought and maybe change their mind about leaping on the cat or dog. And it works well for them. But back to us humans, what about us? Why would we have those hairs? They really don't keep us warm. Anyone who wants to tell me otherwise just needs to stand outside on a cold winter's day in their shorts and see how long they hold on to that idea. And those hairs don't do anything at all to signal to another person or animal that you feel threatened and should be seen as dangerous. So does it make more sense that we have those because we're so carefully designed, or because those hairs are evolutionary remnants of a mechanism that our ancestors had, much like those aluminum wires and lead pipes in the walls of my friend's newly renovated country house? Now here's another silly example. Again, I'm going to ask, does this make more sense as something that a careful master designer specifically gave us, or that we inherited from our ancestral predecessors? Here it is. The fact that some people can wiggle their ears. All humans have tiny muscles attached to our ears, which some people have learned to activate. And in that way, that's how they wiggle their ears and move their scalp. And again, many animals, dogs, cats, horses, deer, amongst others, have those same muscles on their ears, which they use to turn their ears towards sounds. Humans, on the other hand, don't swivel their ears towards sounds. We have other strategies for taking in the sensory information that we need to survive. So my point is, why would a master designer give us those muscles for our ears and our scalp? Or does it make sense that those muscles on our ears are also evolutionary hangovers from our ancestral precursor species? And what about fingernails and toenails? Here's a third example. I'll throw it out there very quickly. Do you really think those were specifically designed for a particular purpose in us humans? Or are they too simply leftovers of the claws that our prehistoric ancestors once used to catch prey?
I like these examples because they're very relatable. The idea that, these are things that we all experience, the idea of goosebumps, seeing someone who could wiggle their ears. What you're committing yourself to, especially when you have this kind of creationist approach, is you're really committing yourself to affirming that everything was on purpose. And once you go down that road, you can't cherry pick your data. You can't just decide, like, I'm going to celebrate how beautiful this is and not look at the weird stuff. And as we'll get to, the dangerous stuff. I find this as a problem across the board, though, that people want to celebrate and attribute things that happen to them what I call a micromanager god.
Exactly.
And
Right.
so, the god who helped you find that parking spot in a busy mall or something like that, that god was micromanaging your life and has actually like altered things around you to make certain things happen. And it's not so much that I say that, oh, that's not credible or something like that. I'm just like, I want you to follow that story through to the end. And this is something that's done brilliantly by, say, Dostoevsky in his Rebellion chapter in the Brothers Karamazov. Let's talk about what a god who micromanages everything has done. Let's talk about tsunamis. Let's talk about natural disasters. Let's just even leave aside like human stuff. Let's not get into killing fields, Holocaust, things like that. Let's actually just talk about things where people just suddenly they're wiped out or there's sudden plague. If you're going to say that God willed these things to happen, then you got to say he willed it all to happen. And as you follow that story through, you're like, it gets more and more uncomfortable.
I'm always embarrassed when I hear these stories. You see them on TV where the people will say they saw the tornado bearing down on them or something else happening. People will say, but God spared us. Meanwhile, they're standing beside their neighbors who just lost their kids in their house.
Oh, yeah. No, the best example for me was I lived in New Orleans through Katrina. And when we evacuated, but when we all got back, we started sharing stories of our evacuations. And friends of ours who evacuated to Beaumont, Texas, to stay at one of like her grandmother's, and they went to church there, right on the border between Texas and Louisiana. And the pastor there like was just like, it was like full fire and brimstone, like, and that Katrina was a judgment on New Orleans' sinful, decadent ways, which is such a jerk thing to do when you know that there are actual Katrina refugees in your, like, that you're speaking to.
Right.
But the best part of it is 2 weeks later, Hurricane Rita hit and flattened that church. And it's like, oh, well, what were you up to then? Like, if this is all like this instant karmic judgment on your life, then, but once you start to attribute direct causal relationships between God and something that just happened, you are opening up a can of worms that I think you don't want to open up.
Right, yeah.
And so to me, those serious examples from a moral perspective have their counterparts in their more serious examples from the physical perspective. It's not just about ears and hairs.
Yeah.
What are the two best ones for you?
Right. So I just want to say the examples I gave so far, I'm going to admit right up front, those are silly, they're humorous, they're unimportant, they have no theological impact. But I have other examples, and these ones are really challenging. They're even disturbing because these designs, if they were intentionally put there by a master designer, would really call into question the competence or the goodness of that designer. Now, hear me out before you respond emotionally to what I'm going to say. I already warned the listeners that this discussion is going to be difficult, but honest and critical. I started this episode off with a story about choking on my coffee and how that's the reason why I'm no longer a big advocate of intelligent design. We all know how easy it is to get food or liquid down our windpipe, and we can relate to the coughing fit that completely embarrasses us and sometimes kills us. That's the problem. That problem is simply a result of the fact that our food pipe and our windpipe converge on the same opening on our face. That simple little detail in our design makes life really difficult for many people. People like Stephen Hawking, who they have diseases that rob them of the ability to control the muscles in their throat. So they're always having to struggle against the saliva that builds up all the time and interferes with their breathing. Or those people who simply decide to go and enjoy a nice steak and end up choking to death on a bite that was just a bit too big. Or those people that go swimming and take a breath at the wrong time and they end up drowning. Those people that develop major problems from stomach acids making their way into their lungs. These are all problems, huge problems for many, many people. And it's all because of the design of our windpipe and food pipe converging at the back of our mouths. That kills ordinary people who really didn't do anything wrong. They just chose to eat too quickly or to breathe at the wrong time, or they were born with the disease outside of their control. Nothing at all deserving of a death sentence. And here's the important thing. It didn't need to be that way. There's no good functional reason why, if we were designed from scratch, from the bottom up, why our food pipe and windpipe need to converge on the same opening on our face. It could have been possible to keep those two tubes entirely separate, especially since the windpipe already has a separate connection to the nose. It just seems to me that an omniscient and omnipotent and micromanaging designer would anticipate these problems and design it differently. There's no good reason to think otherwise. So to illustrate my point, I like to tell little stories, and this one I think illustrates the point very well. I've sometimes used this analogy of award-winning architects putting up a 20-story building, but wanting to do so using a new and innovative design. This building would have a totally redesigned stairwell. a fancy multifunctional stairwell that they pitch as the latest innovation in building design. They're going to do three things. First, the metal railing of the stairwell would be used to conduct high voltage to different parts of the building, instead of the old way of doing things, which is just to have completely separate wiring and the proper shielding and bury those wires in the walls. They say that's just too old school. We're going to double duty the stairwell. Second, they also decide to use the stairwell as a chimney for the furnace in the basement, for the incinerator in the garage, and a diesel generator that serves as a backup power supply. Rather than building a separate chimney, they would just vent the exhaust fumes from those three sources through the stairwell and out the top of the building. Now, the stairwells are also used by humans to move from one level to the other, and obviously humans don't tolerate high voltages and exhaust fumes too well. And these architects are smart and compassionate. So here's the third thing they do. They include motion detectors that shut off the electricity and the exhaust ventilation when they detect people in the stairwell. And then both functions are turned back on when they sense that the people have left the stairwell. And that system works really well for the most part. However, every once in a while, the motion detectors just don't notice that someone's still in the stairwell, and that person gets electrocuted or chokes to death on the fumes. But for the most part, there isn't a problem, right? And here's the million-dollar question. Why would we put up with that design? We wouldn't. At the very least, that building would be closed down until proper renovations were done. And if the listener didn't already know that I was using this as an argument against intelligent design, you might otherwise agree with me that those architects should be given fines, if not imprisonment. So when we look at this convergence of the trachea and the esophagus, the food pipe and the windpipe, which works for the most part, but every now and then kills people, why do we call this for what it is? It's a bad design, and one that takes on a very dark element if we attribute it to an omniscient and omnipotent designer. Instead, as a scientist and fellow believer, I understand the food pipe and the windpipe situation entirely differently. It makes more sense to me that we evolved from very primitive organisms that first absorbed food and oxygen through the skin. And as those organisms got bigger and more complex, to such an extent that simply absorbing through the skin was no longer enough, they then developed a tube leading into the center of their bodies to get large chunks of food down there where it was digested. And then, of course, the remaining waste would be ejected out the other end. Those bugs could still absorb oxygen through their skin because it's a gas and moves more easily, but it's just a fundamental difference between gases and chunks of food that the latter just don't go through the skin very well. But eventually, as these ancestral organisms got really big and complex, they needed another mechanism to get the oxygen into the deeper parts of the body. And so they just used that same central tube, which took food and liquids and water and air in one end and ejected the waste products out the other end. But finally, when the evolving animals got even bigger yet and more complex and needed to develop specialized lungs to deal with larger volumes of air, that central tube running down the middle of the body is just split into two, one leading to lungs and the other one to the stomach, and a specialized valve to keep the food out and not clog up those lungs. That makes more sense to me than a carefully considered design from the bottom up.
And what I'm taken with in this account is the fact that one of the reasons I think people struggle with this is almost a problem of a lack of imagination, because it really is a lot of time that's required for these things to happen as adaptations, that natural selection mutation mechanism. And it's sometimes a little brain boggling to sort of think of casually throwing off, oh, another few million years.
Sorry?
Just, 1,000 times longer than any human history, right? Like that's just one of these things that happened here. And so when you start talking in these orders of magnitude, I think it can be difficult for people to just sort of absorb, if they haven't thought about it in a long time, to say like, no, that just seems completely implausible, because the numbers just get so big. And everyone, when they think of a long time, they think of spans that are related to themselves. They think of spans that are related to their lives, and then maybe their history, and then maybe ancient human history. But if you go back to ancient human history, even if you go back like tens of thousands of years to our first sort of indications of human civilizations, you're not even getting like near a significant digit like of what we're talking about here.
Right.
And so that's, I think, one of the problems that people come up against this, because if there was no imagination fail of trying to encompass the sheer span of time it would take for this to happen, then I just think it's obvious. Cannot look at the confluence of the air intake and food intake systems in the human being and think, oh, that's a good idea. Like there's just no way to get there. Like there's just no way to do it. And that example all on its own isn't like a compelling example against this kind of creationism. is because of the imagination that it requires to get your brain around the length of time it would take for the succession of adaptations to take place.
I wanted to come back on this idea of how believable is it that these changes can happen randomly and in an undirected manner. And I'll say right up front, I haven't finished thinking this through. So I'm sharing with the listeners now. I'm halfway through this thinking. This comes back to what Boyd was saying earlier about Behe basically telling the scientific community, look, this idea that everything happened completely by random chance mutations, small changes, and a gradual accumulation of individual small changes doesn't explain what we see today. There has to be something else. And even the secular scientific community will recognize there is more to it than that. But here's the thing that I'm still wrestling through. Who says that these mutations are completely random and undirected? That's just a worldview. We explored in great detail one scientific example of an orchestrated or directed set of genetic changes with Dr. James Shapiro in episode number 70. That's 70. Someone says up front, they are undirected. There's nothing to direct those changes. And maybe there's more to the story than that. And
yeah, and I understand as a scientific methodology that that's absolutely the way you go through it, right? You don't posit things that you don't need to posit when you're trying to account for phenomena as a scientist. And that completely makes sense to me. But the positive assertion, which I think that evolutionary scientists are a little too cavalier when they make positive assertions about history. I think that scientists generally always have a lot of credibility when they talk about what happens, because those are things that are easily replicable in laboratory experiments, easy to disprove. But when you start making concrete claims about what happened in the past, then you're on much shakier ground just simply because the methodology was not designed to do that.
Right.
And so you have to start to almost jury rig these special scientific methodologies that involve retrodictions and taking the hypothesis model and stretching it a little,
right.
Which is good. It's a good thing to do because at least it gives you something to go on and ways to sort of at least disprove things, if not prove anything. But then I find this word cropping up, this word randomness, which in many ways to me feels like the god of the gaps in science and in biological science. I'm not talking about like quantum mechanics or something like that, where they have a pretty firm grasp on what they're talking about. But in the biological sciences, where you talk about random mutation, I remember getting one scientist in a discussion to say, okay, undirected, there's no end in sight. It wasn't converging towards this, what in philosophy would call teleological. It's not directed towards an end. That's all we're insisting on. Because to assert positively that something is random is, you can't do that. That's actually an impossible to falsify assertion. All you're saying is, if there's a pattern, we can't see it.
That's right.
And so to me, it does feel very God of the gaps-ish. We're just going to label all those things where we don't see patterns random.
Right.
And that's where I start to get nervous. And I do think that that's one of the things that I'm glad intelligent design started to push this issue, because this is a little bit more of a sort of, a word I tend to not want to use in normal conversation. It's a metaphysical issue. This gets into the what are scientists doing and what counts as science issue. And part of me is really glad that they brought it up. Part of me is actually not as glad that intelligent design brought this issue up, because I actually think that the scientific community was already in the throes of having this fight before these people came along.
All right. Yeah, they were.
And I feel like this fight led to a sort of tribal defensive crouch that stopped the discussion for a couple of decades. And I think the discussions that were being started with Gould and Eldridge and punctuated equilibrium, the idea that all mutations and adaptations don't actually have to be beneficial, that often animals are in much more serene environments where everything is not all this like what blood, tooth, and claw thing that you said. And then suddenly disasters come along. And these weird mutations that manage to survive suddenly become the ones that are key to their surviving this cataclysmic event. Yeah, so I think one of the things I would love to see is that the scientific community gets over its fear that the creationists are going to take them over and go back to like fighting with each other, which is what makes for better science.
Let me come back. I just want to give the listeners a little bit of information, background to what Boyd was getting at with the cataclysmic event thing. There's scientific explanations coming out now that are much bigger and better than the simple, small, gradual mutations, random and undirected. For example, some of the things that they're talking about are gene duplications or triplications and quadruplications, meaning copies of these genes, which then get kind of filed away in the corner, and mutations can gradually accumulate in those, and they don't impact the organism in any way because they still have a good functioning original gene. But then along comes some cataclysmic event, which all of a sudden now that duplicate gene, which already had 5 or 6 mutations accumulated in it, all of a sudden that gene is now functions very differently and is very useful to survive that. So that's one of the scientific explanations for how we can see mutation, which is not simply a small change built on a small change built on a small change. There's also information, other ideas that are coming out that genes are not the only story. There's information stored in the skin of the cells, the membrane of the cells. The membranes are covered with various molecules. We call them glycoproteins. Those are sugar proteins. And there's tremendous amounts of information in that glycoprotein shell. Even some of the machinery inside the cell, all the cells, the eggs, for example, inherit machinery from the mother. And there's already information encoded in that machinery, the little molecular motors. So I'm just throwing out a few ideas, which are basically all saying, look, there's a lot more to evolution than simply minor, random, undirected mutational changes.
I'm pretty sure actually that and anything I say now is probably going to get cut in the final analysis. But this goes back to a 19th century issue, right? Because I feel like when you talk about the glycoprotein membrane thing, that there's a sort of return to a Lamarckianism almost, that there's the Lamarckian idea that it wasn't just random mutation, but that somehow the experience is getting coded and passed on.
Right. That too is epigenetics. There is scientific data for what you're saying there, Boyd.
And so I always was sort of fascinated with the Lamarckian theory that got basically obliterated by Darwinism. Because I think that if you talk about a system of evolution where that Lamarckianism idea, where things that happen to me before I procreate will somehow make it through to my children. So the things that I learned to adapt,
Right, yeah.
not just these random genetic mutations, I actually think the story becomes much more plausible.
Right.
And so this, I'm interested as the listener. I know very little about the current state of epigenetics. Shockingly, that
Right.
I don't know this, but
Well, we'll need to get into that, but already we're over time, and that is a huge topic. We'll come back to that sometime. But I want to finish off just with one other example. I gave the listeners 3 examples that were really silly and humorous and unimportant. And then I gave that one example that I think really challenges the idea of a micromanager, creator, God. And here's the last one I'll give in that category. And this, to me, is really the strongest example I've ever come across that challenges that idea. And in a word, it's childbirth. Even in today's modern Western world, childbirth sometimes goes horribly wrong. Maybe the baby hasn't positioned properly, or it's unusually large compared to the mother, or the mother's spine and pelvis are just too small, or there's an abnormal shape that she has in her pelvis and her spine. Either way, the result for many women and babies is a horrible death. And for most of them, this is a long and gruesome and painful death. In other cases of childbirth going wrong, the mother bleeds to death or dies because the placenta doesn't come out fully and then becomes toxic inside her. And again, here's the thing. There are many other less threatening ways to solve the problem of delivering a baby out of the mother's body. Let's just spitball here. Maybe pushing forward through another new opening in the belly rather than downward through the mother's pelvis. That's the fundamental problem. The baby has to go through the hole in the mother's pelvis. Or maybe pushing the baby out when it's much less well-developed and smaller, the way marsupials like kangaroos and opossums do, and then finishing the process of development outside the mother's body in some way. And I can come up with even crazier alternatives, and I'll agree with you fully that these might sound silly to us, but that's only because our current form of childbirth has just become so normal to us. But there's no fundamental reason why, if you're designing humans from scratch, from the drafting table on up, as it were, why the baby has to go through the pelvis of the mother. On the other hand, it's more reasonable to me that an impersonal process like evolution once again solved the problem in the simplest way, just by adding a small diversion to an already existing pathway. You couldn't use the food pipe or the windpipe as a previously existing pathway because that approach was already bad enough when there was just 2 pathways being joined together. But there were already 2 other pathways already available, and both of them already functioning to push things out of the body. The one that got rid of solids from the stomach, and the other that got rid of liquids from the kidneys. And as it turns out, both of those pass through the mother's pelvis. Now, it's a no-brainer why evolution chose to join up to the ureter rather than the intestine. I mean, the complications of a bacterial filth, enough said.
Yeah.
And so that strategy of connecting up to the ureter worked really well for millions of years in our smaller, simpler ancestral species. But as humans evolved and became more intelligent with bigger heads, we reached a critical point at which the advantages of our bigger heads, because our species got so smart, had to balance against the disadvantages of complicating childbirth, even to the point of sometimes risking killing the mother and baby. It's a horrible design flaw that I find easier to attribute to an impersonal evolutionary process. So in all these examples of bad design that we've talked about, from the silly ones like goosebumps and ear wiggling and fingernails to the horrible ones like choking and childbirth, does it make more sense that were carefully designed from the bottom up by a master micromanaging intelligence, or that we came to be this way through a mechanism that involved trial and error and gradual accumulation of bits and pieces of old designs with new designs built on top of those, like the old stone schoolhouse that my friends renovated into a beautiful modern house?
The childbirth one I find fantastic simply because A, there's a sort of symmetry to it, right? To the choking, which is like the avenues of getting things in and out of the body. There's a strong evolutionary reason for why you want to minimize the ways in and out, right? As far as just having a concrete protection around you.
Yeah.
And that you would double use things at both ends would make a lot of sense. I'd never really thought about it in terms of the fact that the problem with the biology of childbirth exists is in fact a problem of the skeleton, right? The fact that you shouldn't have to go through anything skeletal to get out of the body, right? And it happens to go.
Yeah.
A woman cannot give birth without literally deforming her skeleton. Your actual hips get wider because you have to like change your skeletal structure almost to get the kid out of your body. And so there's this like hip dysplasia. But the other aspect of it is that Luke and I have jabbed back and forth, like I accuse him of this sort of chronological snobbery, right? But the very like earliest stories that you find in the Hebrew Bible, you can't get like 3 chapters into Genesis without them like acknowledging this childbirth thing is stupid, right? And so they have to like they frame it as a punishment, right? They frame it as there's going to be pain in childbirth, right? That this is somehow a result of the fall. This is the result of a sin. This is the accounting. And so the fact that thousands of years ago, people are talking about this, like this has got to fit in somewhere. It's almost like they've seen this problem. It's like, yeah, why would the God create us, like make us die in childbirth, right? Which remember, and for the listeners, like sometimes this kind of escapes people. When we talk about like the extension of the human lifespan and like how long the average human being lives, we're talking about 3 things. One is public health and the control of disease. One is neonatal care and kids surviving. But if you take the lifespan of, say, kids who survive to the age of 5 and how long are they expected to survive versus kids like 200 years ago, it's really public health and childbirth. Like childbirth is one of the single most threatening things to the human species as far as survival.
Right.
That is horrible design.
Right.
That is like, it's just, yeah, to me, either example stands on its own as just a horrible idea if you were designing it.
And I'm going to come back in a moment to the whole fall thing, because that does often get brought up in this context. But I want to deal with something else first. Why do we as Christians have to believe that God carefully designed every aspect of our being? Why can't we believe that he used natural mechanisms like the random and impersonal process of evolution to create us? We get that idea from an overly literal reading of Genesis, or I'll say a casual and even sloppy reading of Genesis. Because if you're going to put so much weight on the words on that page of the Bible, then look closely at what it actually says. First, many times God just simply says, let there be. Let there be light, for example. But it doesn't specifically say how he did that. It doesn't actually rule out him using naturalistic mechanisms like stellar evolution, aka the Big Bang, or planetary evolution, chemical evolution, biological evolution. He could use those as well. Second, after each one of those phrases, it also says, and God made such and such. But read that through the eyes of an ancient Near Eastern writer. Is that any different than an emperor or a king saying, let there be a building that contains all our treasures and artwork? And then he casually sits down while everyone else around him scrambles to get it done. And then at the grand unveiling of this new building, that emperor again stands up, spreads his arms and hands and says, look at this amazing thing that I have made. And then third, what else does that text in Genesis say? Twice, it quotes God saying, let the land produce. So in verse 11, it says, let the land produce plants and trees. And in verse 24, let the land produce living creatures. Check it out for yourself. This is essentially a great way for a pre-scientific ancient Near Eastern Hebrew author to describe biological evolution. So up until we get to the second half of the so-called day 6, none of this describes God sitting at a workbench and personally building with his own hands. But it does specifically say that about the creation of humans, made out of dirt and inspired with his own breath, which, by the way, he also gave to all animals. That too is something that the listener should check out. This breath is not a spirit, it's the breath of life. But here's the thing. That's precisely the way that everyone in the ancient Near East had been talking for literally thousands of years before the Hebrew authors put pen to paper, so to speak. The Sumerians and Akkadians and Egyptians for thousands of years talking about the gods creating humans from dirt or clay or rocks. And the Hebrew authors here, they just took that language and worldview and incorporated that into the pages of our Bible. It's only the tradition that we built up around that page of the Bible that creates a story or image that conflicts completely with what the second book, the book that scientists read and interpret, what it says.
My brain just like bounces off this stuff that does this present a problem for the theology? Do we have to talk about what they did or didn't know? I like this account where it's like, yeah, that I'd never actually really thought about the land, the let the land produce thematic that pops up there.
Mm-hmm.
And that the only thing I would like push back on a little is like, I wouldn't even talk about the Hebrews incorporating this stuff into their thing. They just were that they are just,
right,
that
yes.
is their
Yeah.
culture,
Yeah.
right? That is the culture they come out of,
right.
that
Yeah.
It's important to believe that. And this is where a creationist theology can really mess you up, is because then you can't acknowledge what is actually perfectly natural, which is that the Hebrew civilization just didn't spring up out of nowhere. It has a history. And so that when you trace back lineages, just like you trace back ancestries, you can do the same thing with cultures. And that culture actually, as you've outlined in those episodes, comes out of previous cultures. And so
right.
the language is to be expected. Of course, they used the same language. That's their language.
Exactly. You mentioned the fall earlier, Boyd, and I want to come back to that very briefly because this is something I've heard many people push back on many times. The fact that these examples you're giving us, Luke, of bad designs are actually broken, that the design was perfect to begin with and it was broken after the fall. But here's the thing. These are not examples of broken versions of previously well-working designs. We do have examples of exactly that. So, for example, the gene for vitamin C. We have a gene in us that could make vitamin C, but it is apparently broken. Other mammals have the same gene and they can make their own vitamin C, but we need to get it from our fruit. It's the same thing with primates. They also have the same gene, which appears to have been broken. There's other examples of what we call pseudogenes. For example, the molecules in your nose that help you to smell things, we call those odor receptors, and there's thousands, literally thousands of different kinds of those. Animals have almost all of those functioning. That's why your dog can smell things that you can't, and sharks can smell blood and water. But we have those same genes and they appear to be broken. So those are examples of broken genes, which, okay, fine. You can argue, you can claim that they were broken during the fall. But I gave you examples that are fundamental design issues. They were not designs gone bad. You would have to completely undo the animal. That whole convergence of the windpipe and the food pipe, you would have to massively redesign the person, in this case Eve, in order to do that. The baby going through the mother's pelvis, the same thing. You would have to completely undo the animal. We're not talking about just a broken gene. We're talking about a complete undoing. So these are not products of the fall that we're talking about. And besides, even if you still wanted to argue that these changes were products of the fall, then why did the fall give us the ability to wiggle our ears or the sparse covering of goosebumps? It doesn't make sense that those are products of the fall. Another pushback that people will give is that they'll find reasons to explain why these funny designs have a function and therefore there was a purpose to that. So for example, people will talk about the baby going through the mother's pelvis. That has functional benefits. There's a whole process involved, and we don't have time to get into that, but there are functional benefits. But you can get the same benefits through other designs. You don't have to do it that way. Same thing with the retina. We can get into how the retina is actually wired backwards, and people will give reasons why it seems to work in a certain way, and therefore it was designed that way. But no, you didn't have to do it that way. You might buy a new house and you notice in the basement there's a broken pipe sticking out of the wall, and you'll think, that's a great place to hang a coat. You wouldn't design a house with a broken pipe to hang a coat, but you'll use the pipe to hang the coat. You'll use a broken lamp to prop open the door. You wouldn't design a broken lamp to open the door, but you'll use it for that purpose. Sometime we'll have to get into more detail on all of these things. So we're just running short on time. And the last thing I want to say is that I'm not done thinking about these things. And so listeners and people who know me may hear me say things that sound contradictory to what we've said today. And I'll give two examples of what I mean. On the one hand, as it turns out, when I was in the process of rejecting everything about Christianity, That's the story I told in the episode called Luke's Deconstruction. It was actually the amazing things that I saw under the microscope every day, the little molecular motors and the details of gene transcriptions and things like that. It was those things that really prevented me from throwing out the idea of a creator God. Despite all my doubts about everything else, Christianity-wise, I was still so convinced that all of this is not some kind of a freak cosmic accident. And that, in turn, is what brought me back to a new version of Christianity. And on the other hand, a bit of a spoiler alert here, is that we'll be doing a topic on fine-tuning of the universe. And that's a subject that I find to be pretty compelling for the design of the universe. And yet that argument for fine-tuning is really at its core similar to the argument for intelligent design. So I'm still conflicted. But I guess the key difference is that I don't find the same kind of examples of malicious and incompetent design in the universe as I see in the human body.
I'm looking forward to the fine-tuning discussion because, as Luke knows, I do see some odd parallels between his arguments against intelligent design and his arguments for fine-tuning. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion.
So before we close out the episode, let's just pull our thoughts together and come to a conclusion. So yeah, as a believer and a scientist, I challenge the idea of intelligent design, or at least a very specific version of intelligent design, a very low-level version of ID that portrays God as a micromanager and directly controlling every little detail. But this in no way needs to take away from the sovereignty of God. I can still see God as the ultimate creator and the sustainer of creation. An analogy that I often use here is two gardeners putting in a garden in the springtime. You've got one gardener who just goes to the local garden shop and buys a whole lot of flowers, different colors, different sizes, takes 6 days to dig up the dirt, as it were, lays the plants down in different arrangements, lines and circles and what have you. And after 6 days of digging up the dirt, they've now got this beautiful garden. And at the end of the year, they pack it in and start again next spring. I'm using 6 days intentionally here. Or you've got another gardener who knows plants, knows bulbs, knows the seeds, knows how to plant them in such a way that this garden doesn't actually have to be put in place, but it unfurls all by itself. Every spring, first you get the daffodils and the tulips, and then other perennials will come in and show their flowers, and then the trees with their leaves, and then as the fall comes in, the trees show different colors. And the point is, this gardener knows her plants and creates a garden that every year just unfurls all by itself. That too is a great gardener. And I would argue it's a better gardener than the one that just took 6 days to dig up the dirt, as it were, and put the things in place.
What makes you nervous about an episode like this?
Okay, that's our discussion from 3 years ago. So, Scott, what did you think?
Yeah, that was a very good discussion. And I'm really looking forward to building on that kind of foundation in explaining the ID movement and talking to a few more experts on intelligent design. We're going to talk to Michael Behe himself, who's one of the leaders of the movement and one of the top experts. We really want to be fair to all sides of the discussion. So in the coming weeks, I'm looking forward to moving the ball down the road, I guess, a bit further.
Yes, we did have a lot of fun talking to Dr. Behe. He is indeed one of the pillars in the intelligent design movement. He's been there for decades, and Scott recounted some of the books that he's written. And in fact, Dr. Behe was an expert witness at one of the most famous court trials in the creation evolution world.
Yeah.
The Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District court case, when ID advocates there in the States were trying to have ID incorporated into the school curriculum. So we're going to hear his spin, Dr. Behe's spin on intelligent design. And I pushed back on some of his points.
Yeah, I think we had a great discussion. He's a very easy guy to talk to, and I didn't feel that it was all adversarial. It was just two people talking about two different perspectives on the issue and getting feedback. So anyway, yeah, I think people really enjoy that discussion.
And I did push back because, well, I mean, strong arguments have been raised against intelligent design. And I shared that with him in advance. We talked briefly, he and I and Scott, and through both email and some pre-chat, and just said, look, I do have some concerns, some questions based on pushbacks that I've read about, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. So you're going to hear what he has to say. But before we get into the weeds with Dr. Behe, we'll play him in 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to cover some basic concepts that I think you, the listeners, need to be brought up to speed on. You may not have a strong background in genetics and cell biology, and so that's what we're going to do next week.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, because after talking to Dr. Behe, I started doing some research on some of the things that you guys were discussing. what's an enzyme, what's a protein, those kinds of things, just to have a little bit more understanding. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are probably in a similar boat that I am. So really looking forward to that episode.
So for that reason, next week, Scott and I are going to wheel in the big blackboard into the studio, the virtual studio, and give an introductory lecture on a favorite topic of mine, genetics and cell biology. I've got an undergrad degree in biochemistry and graduate degrees in how biochemistry becomes physiology, so I think I can give a good and accurate picture of the basic science. And Scott, you...
Well, I have no expertise in it, but I'll tell you this, I have great curiosity and great interest, and I have had for my whole life in science and in biology in particular. So even though I claim no academic credentials or anything like that, I have a few microscopes, and I just have a keen interest. And so I think
I've said before to the listeners now, one of the first times that I really got to know Scott, he contacted me. We didn't really know too much about each other at that time. And he contacted me to say, how do I create a stain for my cells when I look at them under the microscopes? He wanted a certain color stain for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I love the natural world. I love learning about it. It's endlessly fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
Scott...
It won't be a discussion for me so much. I'll just be listening, but...
Right, and Scott's going to be the perfect person to ask the kinds of questions where I'm just assuming too much. I get that a lot of times when I talk about something and people say, you're a little bit over my head, and I just assume too much. So Scott will be a great person to say, hey guys, come on, big picture here. And the reason we want to do that separate episode next week before Dr. Behe's presentation is because his main arguments revolve around the building of molecular machines using proteins with very specific 3D structures. And so we're going to talk a bit about how proteins are made and then how those proteins are shaped into functional parts that stick together and do specific jobs. I think that's going to help the listener follow what Dr. Behe's talking about. And because all of that starts with the genetic sequence being decoded into the basic proteins, and for that matter, how changes in the genetic sequence become the mechanism for evolution, we'll need to get into some very basic genetics as well. And in the process, here's the third thing that I want to do next week. We're going to stimulate in you, the listener, an ear for hearing what people are saying when they talk about genes and protein, genetics and cell biology, as it pertains to the question of how evolution works or doesn't work. So that's for next week.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, out there, and especially if you read some of the materials from the more conservative points of view, a lot of things are said that when you look into them, you discover that they're not very good arguments, or that biology doesn't support them, and so on. So having some basic understanding, I think, will go a long way.
Okay, so we'll see you next week. Bring your notebooks, pads, and pens.
Will do.
Okay, see you then.
Yeah, see you later.
Ciao. Bye now. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.